All right, Tom, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining, and we're so happy to have you today.
Thanks for inviting me, Michael. Appreciate to be here. Always good to talk with you.
Absolutely. Well, Tom, we're going to get right into talking about business analysis communication or communication in business analysis. I think everybody pretty much knows that communication is, a core skill set in pretty much every career path, but
Hmm.
especially for a business analyst, right? Because we're
Correct.
constantly communicating with so many different roles.
Hmm.
So let's start off by talking about some of the foundations of effectiveness for communication, especially in business analysis. And I know in your book, Building Bridges for Business Analysts, you talk
Hmm.
a little bit about building bridges. So,
Yep.
what does that mean to you in the context of business analysis? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, yeah. It's a great question, Michael. So what I mean there by that kind of the analogy of the bridge is kind of to help, building that bridge, be it the business analysts work with so many roles. And I think they're kind of at a pivot point or a fulcrum, if you will, in the business life cycle. The business analyst has, a lot of impact on many things. I, as myself as a developer, see that how important they are to the process. And I think that's one of the things where the bridges are so important to be able to communicate with, be it, a technical person like myself, stakeholders, leaders, project managers, and any other people. There's so many different things in different departments that business analysts have to kind of interface with. So I think that communication is so important. And, Michael, I think a big thing that in so many organizations, I was just talking to somebody earlier today, and they use an acronym. We have so many acronyms at organizations, and it can sometimes go over somebody's head if they're new, or if, for instance, they're from a different department, and they might have a different acronym, so it's confusion. But I think that's where business analysts are like, they're keeping the lights on, making sure the organizations hum, and getting the information to the right people, and asking the right questions, I think, too, because that's all part of that communication process, building the bridges. Because I think business analysts do a good job of asking questions and understanding what people need. Because I think that's an important thing that we all kind of need to understand. As they say in Toastmasters, know your audience. What do they need? What
Yes.
questions and things. So I think that's an important aspect, Michael.
Yeah, that's a great response. And you said something about knowing your audience. But what do you think about the importance of knowing your own communication style or your communication type? How
Hmm.
does that play into knowing your audience versus knowing yourself?
Yeah, very important, Michael. I think that's one thing that I think people need to know their style and their way they like to communicate for a number of reasons. But first of all, people can tell when, like if Tom tried to be like Michael and adopt your style, people could tell, oh, Tom, what's Tom doing here? We all need to kind of be our own authentic self and know how we like to communicate. But I think too, another thing too is to understand as we know our own style, we need to understand how other people like to receive information. And I think that's an
Yeah.
important aspect. I remember I was going through some training a few years ago, and it can be your, how old you are, it can be your generation, it could be just what you're used to. And I always like to preface that by saying, some people like to receive a text message, some people like a Slack message, some people like an email. But I always like to point out my mom, who's in her 80s, loves to text people. She's always on her
Yeah.
phone. So it's not necessarily age related, but I think you need to know the style or the mode that's best for the message too, because that's another thing. We've probably all seen this. There's, stories on the news and things of this where people got let go by an email or a text message or things of that nature. Now that's something that, it makes us all kind of wince and think, what were they thinking? That's an important thing when you think about the message is the best method, right? When we have to give a message, because there's things that are real. If you and I are working in the same office and maybe we're going to meet for lunch in a little bit, we not just send a quick Slack message or a text message. But
Mm.
there's some conversations like if you're having a difficult coaching conversation where you'd like to be either in person or like we are on camera where you can see that person and kind of read their body language, because I think that's an important thing to think about when we are communicating and that what the message is.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think as business analysts, we definitely should be intentional about understanding that, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And going back to some of those more traditional efforts, like defining a communication plan, or even when we are looking at a project overall, we kind of need to look at how easy or difficult is it to communicate with the stakeholders. That could help determine whether or not we're going to want to do something like waterfall or agile. So
Hmm.
just those basic, very core, simple things are really, some of the linchpins that can really get the project off to a good start if we're intentional about understanding those things. So that's definitely some good advice there. Awesome. Many of the business analysts that I coach and train,
Hmm.
they struggle during meetings, like structured meetings. So, what advice do you have for business analysts who might be either participating in meetings or facilitating a meetings that feel like they're struggling, especially with discussions around technical things? What
Hmm.
advice do you have for business analysts around getting confidence in those meetings?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Michael. I think one big thing that I think is really important is just to be, to be honest, to be yourself. If there's something that you might find confusing or isn't clear, I think that's a great point to share that, because usually when you have a question, there's usually somebody else that, or maybe many somebody else's that have that same question. And I think an important aspect of communication is that C word I used a little bit ago, clarity, and making sure we're on the same page. And just that simple technique, you've probably used it yourself, Michael, of restating what somebody said, especially if you're talking like to a stakeholder and making sure you understand, and making sure everybody understands. Because sometimes, as we work in a world where, some of us are on Zoom, some of us are in person, some people might hear things and some people might not. And even things like, I I used to live in the Midwest where people talk a little slower. They're a little more intentional, kinder. Maybe I don't. I guess maybe I shouldn't say that. But anyways, I've moved closer to New York City, East Coast. I'm near Philly now, and people will talk faster. And that's one thing, just simple. When people start talking really fast, you're like, "Whoa, whoa, Tom, slow down." I
Yeah,
think that's an important thing where if people, or even some people, you probably notice this too, Michael. Some people, if they get excited, they talk really fast. Or
yeah,
some of them will. And this is actually one I remember. I had a teacher that was really good at kind of bringing the class when the kind of the noise would be, people would get a little crazy, but talking a little slower and even a little softer gets people to
mhm,
really tune in. They, oh, what are they
yes,
talking about? So just those kind of techniques that a business analyst could use to kind of bring things together, and to ask questions about, kind of clarifying and making sure everybody understands what maybe a stakeholder said, something really important, but they might have missed. So I think that's
yeah.
an important aspect.
Yeah, and one thing you said about with the clarity is I've heard that it's really important to, whenever you are making a point that's really significant, to pause for a moment after that,
Mm.
to allow time for the audience to absorb, because a lot of people are uncomfortable with that silence. And how do you feel about struggling to speak? I feel like many BAs feel like they are maybe an ancillary role or not
Hmm.
quite as significant as other roles. So they might not feel like they should be contributing. They feel like they should always be, just consuming information and writing it down. But
Hmm.
in those situations where there's either a difficult situation
Hmm.
or they really need to just speak up or share an opinion, is there any particular advice you have around that?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, Michael, and I've seen this with business analysts and I've seen it with technical people as well. Sometimes when we get drawn into a meeting, we want to either, like you mentioned, take a lot of notes or try to understand things. And I think a couple things that I've seen helpful. I was coaching a team member at one time. His name was Joseph, and he was really analytical, but he liked to share a lot. And one of the things his leader actually asked me to kind of work with him on, being succinct and giving good answers, be it an email or be it in a
Mm,
meeting. And I think that's one of the things where if we can get, for instance, like if you have a meeting, if you have an agenda ahead of time, that way people will know,
yes.
okay, I need to key in on these things. Maybe even bring, for instance, you might bring some notes or something, or write up something you want to, maybe a question you want answered or something, kind of so you feel prepared. Because I think, like you said, that we can kind of get anxious that, oh, am I saying the right thing, or have we covered that? just simply kind of having a few things like ready to go and say, okay, I want to, a few points I want to make. And then, you can always take notes, but I think one thing I've found where people can get too enamored in, trying to write down everything said, but just being present and
Yeah.
think about, okay, what did Michael just say? How did he say it? Kind of thinking about those things and kind of another thing I like to do in a meeting, it's a little harder in Zoom, especially if people don't have their cameras on, but it's
Mm.
possible, virtually and in a real meeting, but just kind of to soak it in, see how people are reacting. Because if you can tell, if somebody's watching the camera, they're engaged. But if they're over here, maybe, they might be checking email or something too, to kind of read and see how people are listening. So I think those are important things to read the people in the room and in the meeting. And then two, like I said, being prepared and being able to kind of just be ready, but to just, take a breath, relax, you're going to be fine.
Absolutely. Preparedness is so important. And that's actually a good segue into because you talked about having agendas and things like that. And preparedness and earlier you mentioned something about asking the right questions. And we
Mhm.
know that when we are doing requirements elicitation, communication is like the core, right?
Mhm.
Um, so what would you say are some of the essentials for making sure that we are asking the right questions and being prepared for requirement elicitation?
Yeah. That makes me think of a few things, but off the top of my head, one of the things I think is important. I was reading something about a journalist, and they were talking about how important, as a journalist, you need to have certain question answered. But then, too, another thing that I think I heard somebody talk about is to think about this question: is you hear a conversation, think about what's not being said,
Mm,
because sometimes there's something that, sometimes it can be there's something big and people don't want to talk about it, or maybe somebody's not addressing something,
yeah.
and that's something where it's important to think about as a business analyst, but kind of use that kind of journalistic training. We probably all had that when we
Mm,
were in school. They want to know the what, where, and when, and the important things. But like I said too, taking a step back, kind of a wider lens. Okay, what
yeah.
aren't people talking about that maybe you thought, oh, I thought we would talk more about X, and we haven't
Yeah.
talked about that at all.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I am a huge advocate of having a pre-generated list of questions. So
Hmm. Hmm.
one of the things that I offer to my community is an enormous list of requirement solicitation questions because you can't think of everything every
Correct.
time, right? So it's
Hmm.
good to have a resource that you can refer back to say, yeah, I think these questions are germane or relevant to this particular project. I'm going to ask that. To your point, you also want to make sure you know what's not being asked. So you want to think about what you're going to do with the answer to that question,
Hmm.
because that's where
Hmm.
you kind of go down the rabbit hole. Like, okay, a
Yes.
developer
Hmm.
might need to know this, so they might also need to know XYZ or whatever,
Correct.
right? So thinking about who is going to use the answer to that question and what they're going to need to do with it is a really good way to, build your question list.
Mm.
And in addition to that, probing, right? We
Yeah.
ask questions, but we get a response back. But then we
Hmm.
also need to further probe, right, to get more rich questions or more, I'm sorry, more rich responses that
Yeah.
we know we can plug in to the requirements further down the line. So
Hmm. Yeah. That's
definitely some key factors there.
hmm Yeah, I think that you bring up a good point about that probing, kind of understanding what's going on. Maybe there's some things under, kind of you've heard of the question behind the question, or trying to understand people's motives. Another thing I heard somebody talk about the importance of hidden requirements, right? There are
Mhm.
requirements that we might, talk about, but there might be hidden requirements to, it could be something from, oh, if something happens, a certain person needs to be notified, and nobody talks about that, but or you've probably been parts of projects too where there's something kind of everybody understands that if
Yes.
something bad happens, we need to do X, right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that might not be documented anywhere, but it's just
Right.
kind of that tribal knowledge that people at that organization, they know, oh yeah, this happens, we have to do this.
Yeah, yeah, those are what we call the implicit requirements, right? The
Hmm.
things that
Hmm.
aren't necessarily explicitly stated, but they're kind of like just there, right? And
Hmm.
I like to, we do have those frameworks, like you mentioned, the
Hmm.
5 Ws and an H method or
Yep.
the 5 Ys, but also it's really good to observe or walk the floor, right? So you can see
Hmm.
what the stakeholders are doing in
Yeah.
their natural environment, right?
Hmm.
Some of those things that they're so close to that they don't even think to share it with anyone because it's so
Yep.
ingrained in their day-to-day work that they don't even think to communicate it to someone else. But
Hmm.
for an outsider looking in, that might be an area of interest. Like, so why do
Yeah.
you always have to send an email after you do XYZ, right? Or
Hmm.
something like
Hmm.
that, right? They might have certain workarounds that they've been doing for months or years that they no longer even think to share as a part of their process, right? So
Yeah.
those types of things can be really critical in terms of getting those implicit or those requirements that might not be top of mind to the
Hmm.
stakeholders when they're giving you that feedback.
Yeah. Good point. Good point. Yeah. There's lots of things hidden out there. We just got to go searching.
Yes,
Hmm.
absolutely. So, to that point, can you talk about the importance of clarification during requirements in relation to like assumptions or
Mm.
misinterpretation? Do you have any advice on putting up guardrails around that?
Yeah, I think anytime, like with assumptions, Michael, that's an important topic to talk about, as depending on, as I think about a business analyst talking to various different parts of an organization, there would be assumptions that, various parts of the organization might have, but like you said, they might not think to vocalize that because they're, well, everybody knows X, and I
Yes.
think, I have to confess as a technology person myself, we do this all the time. There's certain things we think, well, everybody knows, that, like you said, this is how something works, right?
Mhm.
Well, at the end of the day, maybe some other people don't or don't understand it. Well, and at times that might not be germane. It might not be important. But there's
Yeah.
other times where there's assumptions made about how something's going to be done, and it gets a lot of people in trouble, or
Mhm.
you solve the wrong problem. That's something I see a lot of technology people doing is we make assumptions, then we try
Yeah.
to fix that assumption, and then find out, we go to the business analyst or another stakeholder, and like that's not the problem we wanted to solve. And you're like, oh, I just wasted an hour, a day, whatever, solving a problem
Yeah.
that didn't need to be solved.
Yeah, yeah. And also, I like to have a space for those assumptions too, right?
Mm,
We know that, uh, especially towards the earlier parts of a project, that we might be relying heavily on assumptions. What are we going to do down the line to get those confirmed, right? So
yep.
we might do some hypothesis testing, or we might want to, once new information comes in, we can
Hmm.
confirm it, and then we use that as an input to requirements. So,
Hmm.
also just having, whatever the template or process you have for document requirements, having that place for assumptions so that we can, just be on the same page as, okay,
Hmm.
these are the things that are actually assumptions versus these are the things that's factual knowledge or
Yeah.
that have been confirmed for sure.
Hmm.
Because
Yep.
you can't really get around a project at an earlier stage without assumptions, right?
Correct. Correct.
Don't want to make decisions based off of that.
Hmm. So
Um,
true.
yeah. So, how do you feel about listening? So, we know that listening is a key part of
Hmm.
being actively engaged with stakeholders,
Yep.
specifically, listening more than we speak, right?
Hmm.
Without losing control of a meeting.
Yeah.
So, how do you work around that? Being an active listener while
Hmm.
also facilitating a conversation.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's kind of a good point, Michael. You bring up that it's kind of like juggling because you're
Yes.
trying to facilitate. Kind of like, okay, what are our guardrails here? Maybe, for instance, like we have a half an hour meeting, an hour meeting, whatever. We're trying to stick within that time frame. As in every organization, meetings are running over and things are we're not addressing, but trying to listen, to engage and ask the right questions. So it's kind of a balancing act, if you will, to talk as we talk to the people and ask the questions and use things, like we can use the agenda or other things, questions like you mentioned, templates. It's good to have, different things, kind of different tools in your tool belt to be able to deal with people. You might have people that are quiet and are resistant to talk. So you might need some more questions for them. And then you might have somebody that's going to talk and talk and talk. And you're, Tom, slow down. We need to give,
Yeah.
somebody else time to talk as well. So it's one of those things where you kind of have to, know how to, it's more art than science, if you will. And so it can
Yes.
be tricky, especially for a business analyst trying to rein in various stakeholders, because, you want, at the end of the day, you have to work together and collaborate. So you don't want to make people mad, but you also want to be firm with them. It's kind of like, I think, my wife and I, we have two kids, and you're thinking about, okay, we want to have fun with them, but we also need to, kind of keep some order in the chaos, if you will, of the house, and things of that nature. Similar, like with a meeting or an organization, you want things to get done, and but you want people to enjoy their work as well. So you kind of have to walk that line of, asking the right questions, but then to kind of keeping that framework, the structure in place, so we get, what is the outcome we need for this meeting, what are the questions that we need to answer.
Yeah, for sure.
Hmm.
Awesome. Thank you. All right. So let's shift a little bit to the written communication because that's a big
Hmm.
part of our
Yeah.
role as business analysts, right? We got to get those
Hmm.
requirements documented. So,
Hmm.
in addition to that, we've got emails, we've got, other documentations, we've got user stories,
Hmm.
PRD, stuff like that. What are some of the biggest mistakes you see? Because you have a background specifically in
Hmm.
like the development space, right? So,
Yeah. Yep.
what are some of the biggest mistakes that you have seen that business analysts make in terms
Hmm.
of communicating that written communication?
Yeah. Yeah. I think a big thing, kind of like we were talking about before, like when I was coaching this gentleman named Joseph about being succinct. I think that's an important thing to think about, being succinct at times, right? There are times where we need more documentation, or we need more information. But I think that's one of the things I think is important to think about. Okay, what is the intent here? Who's going to be reading this? And two, kind of, putting our lean hat on there, how can we get feedback on that, right? Here's a requirements document. Well, let's ask a few people and see, what am I missing? Is this too much? Is this not enough? Because I think that feedback can help you as a business analyst understand, okay, oh, this is a real tricky part here. We need a little bit more. Or maybe it's
Yeah.
something that lends itself to maybe some visuals that will help
Yes.
people understand. Maybe it's a flow, if it's a process, an elaborate process. I think those are things that kind of help us with the written documents, and making sure that it's what people need. But then again, too, we don't want to waste our time and other people's time and give them too much, or not the right information.
Yeah, no, that's great. And on one thing you said is the purpose, right? The purpose of
Hmm.
that document.
Yeah.
So for me as a business analyst, I'm always thinking about even an email, how are they
Hmm.
going to use what I'm giving them? So how would a product owner use these user stories?
Yep.
How would a developer use these user stories? So when you think about the person after you that you're going to be, I don't want to say passing it off to or handing it off to,
Hmm.
how are they going to use it? So, what amount of detail would they need, right?
Right.
And another thing that is very important for us is to consider the level of detail that the stakeholder needs, right?
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
one common example is when we're talking to executives, we know we need
Yeah.
summaries, we need high level, but
Uh-huh.
when we talk to business stakeholders, they want to know more about the processes and the business
Hmm.
rules and things like that. Whereas the developers want to know more about the data, the data dictionaries and things like
Yep.
that. So really understanding the level of, like you said, succinctness that each stakeholder needs, but
Hmm.
also to the other end, understanding when there are stakeholders that need more detail, understanding that range of detail versus high level
Hmm.
when we're communicating to certain stakeholders at various
Yeah.
points.
Yeah. I think you
Uh,
bring up such a good point there, Michael, about just kind of the whole idea, like, of understanding, okay, who am I talking to? What do they need? And to kind of adjusting that, because that's where, like I've seen it, and you've probably seen this too. The great business analysts know how to read. Okay, this is, like you mentioned, an executive. They need just a real succinct, like a sentence or two. And this is,
mhm.
okay, we're talking to a business stakeholder. They're going to be more process focused, and they can adjust on the fly. It's like kind of like we were talking about before, that tightrope walker. They know how to do it perfectly, and get the people the right information.
Yeah, exactly.
Mhm.
All right. And to that point, when we're writing things, there's often a little bit of a gap between written communication and spoken communication
Hmm.
in terms of perceptions and interpretations and things like that. How
Hmm.
can business analysts use language in order to reduce that ambiguity when we are writing uh, or using written communication?
Yeah. Yeah. I think the big thing is to be, expressive and explicit in ways to that,
Yes.
using terminology. Like I said before, we sometimes use our acronyms and things, but if maybe it's a glossary or something, but just making sure people are on the same page and that, you know, when we say, for instance, when we say expense report, we're all talking about the same thing, not, something else or kind of a level set, because I think that's there can be a lot of ambiguity about with if we use terms that are vague or not explicit or might be misconstrued as something else. So I think that's important to just make sure the terms mean that what the syntax and the terminology that we're using that we're all agreed upon, and it's kind of that the knowledge or the agreed upon terms for the organization or company you're working for.
Yeah, yeah, that alignment is
Hmm.
so important,
Yep.
making sure that you're using the language or the terminology that those stakeholders are familiar with. And
Hmm.
also, to your point earlier, making sure that you understand the terminology
Right.
before you communicate it to others, right?
Hmm.
And that just makes me think about when I think about alignment, I like to include visuals
Hmm.
because we all know that a picture's worth a thousand words. But I think we can also go too far with the visuals and not include enough context.
True.
Like,
True.
so I think another thing is understanding the balance between the visual and
Hmm.
the language context, how we can use them together
Yep.
to kind of paint a
Yeah.
complete picture, right?
Hmm. What I think it's important to think about, as you think about everybody's different and they learn in different, ways. Some people need to
Yes.
read something. Some people will need that visual to kind of help them piece it all
Mhm.
together. And we all kind of learn in a different style. So I think
Yeah.
that's helpful for people in a number of levels that, if we have, different styles that we bring into our documentation, that it's, something anybody can go to and use.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we talked earlier about the self-awareness of your communication style,
Hmm.
but that's another point for us to consider, right?
Yep.
People's learning styles, right?
Hmm.
Some people are visual learners, some people are textual learners or kinesthetic learners, right? So,
Hmm. Yeah,
very good point.
definitely.
All right, so I alluded earlier to difficult situations or difficult conversations.
Hmm.
What approaches can a business analyst use in these types of situations?
Yeah, I think anytime you have a difficult conversation, I think one big thing is to just to approach it calmly, and understand people. For instance, people are going to might get heated about certain things, and that's understandable. We no one's perfect. I've been there myself, but just kind of to come into it and try not to take things too personal as you are in a conversation or somebody gets a little mad or think that's a thing where we try to, sometimes people are offended or something like that. It's just like I was talking to somebody earlier and they're talking about their organization. They strive to have people be egoless, that they don't want people to worry about, oh, who got the credit or this or that. And I think that's something important to think about. I think as a business analyst, a lot of times I think about the term the utility player, like in a baseball team, and they play a lot of roles. A business analyst does that and they have to know lots of different things as you've talked already about Michael about these questions about these all the things you think about a business analyst has to handle. And I think that's so important is
Yeah,
kind of being that utility player, but then too having a bit of humility really too. I think that's something that I think is
yeah,
important too, because you mentioned stakeholders, executives. There can be a lot of egos that you kind of have to people to come together and be able to get the requirements and get the information that people need. So just kind of think that humility really helps, and a calm demeanor can kind of help keep things in check where maybe some people are getting a little frazzled. They can just kind of bring some calmness to the room.
yeah, absolutely. That humility is so important. And also, going into those conversations, I think to understand the other person's perspective, because I have
Mm,
seen situations where no one's listening. Everybody's just trying to shout out their perspective,
right.
what
Hmm.
they feel and what they want. but they're not seeking to understand what the other person is. So
Mhm.
I think a part of our role in facilitating those conversations is to facilitate understanding. Let's pause, let's let this person talk so that they can get their perspective or understanding out, and then we can let the other person share their perspective, and maybe there's a way that we can get some type of win-win
Mhm.
situation. But sometimes when that resistance to even hear, so this kind of goes back to that listening, right?
Yeah.
People aren't willing to listen to what the other person is even saying, because 50% of the time, if they actually took the time and listened, they
Mhm.
would understand that they're aiming towards the same thing,
Right.
but really just facilitating that both sides listen and seek to understand the other person's perspective can really go a long way in managing those types of
Oh, yeah. I
conversations.
couldn't agree more, Michael. That's a great point because I think, like you said, a lot of times people are just waiting to say what they want to say and not listen.
Yeah.
And two, they kind of just talk past each other.
Mhm.
And you've probably heard this too, where a lot of times where if you listen to things about like mindfulness or the
Mhm.
importance of that is just being present in the moment, listening
Yeah.
and being present, listening to if it's just you and me, we're talking, being present and listening to what you have to say. And
Yeah.
and I think as a business analyst, when you model that, when you model being
Yeah.
present and just listen to people, looking, if you're in a room full of different people, looking around and just taking it in, that's kind of something you can model and show to others, and they will because people like they see how you act, and they want to respect
Right.
that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, mindfulness is so important. I think especially now in the times that we're in,
Hmm.
everybody's multitasking, everybody's got a phone or a
Yeah.
computer, or and
Hmm.
I think sometimes we might even need to just go back to that old school rule, like, put all
Yep.
your cell phones in the basket at the door, or
Right.
make sure that everybody turns off their notifications on their phone. That
Hmm.
could be a ground.
Correct.
Sometimes you have to have ground rules with stakeholders right at the beginning.
Yep. Yep.
Everybody's turned off the notifications and no
Hmm.
emails. Everybody's focused
Yep.
on this particular meeting, right? So yeah,
Hmm.
that mindfulness is really important. But with that said, what would you say is one of the biggest challenges that you've seen that business analysts are facing in terms of communication, and how have you helped them work through it?
Yeah. Yeah. I think kind of like you're talking there, Michael, and I'm thinking it's kind of like to the point that you we were just talking about, like kind of when you think about it, we're in an age where there's so much information coming at us. If we're trying to make a
Mhm.
decision, and the business analyst has to kind of help us, if you will, cut through the noise and make sure we're all
Yeah.
on the same page and we're understanding what people are talking about. We have so many tools. You
Yeah.
think about all the tools we have now. Like with AI and all these things, those tools are helpful, but we have to be able to use them to cut through the noise and get still at the end of the day, we have to, serve our business needs or our organizational needs, and think about how we can, come together and focus on the purpose and bring people, get that clear communication so they know, okay, this is the direction we're heading. And so everybody can
Yeah.
kind of coalesce around that.
Yeah, and you know what? That just brings me to something that I'm always coaching, my mentees about, is going back to those core fundamentals. I
Hmm.
think to your point earlier, there's so many tools and apps out there. Everybody, newer business analysts want to know, well, in order to be a good BA, what apps or what tools do I need to
Yeah.
use?
Yeah.
And I tell them, it's good to use tools, right? Because we know that,
Hmm.
like, in our space, a lot of organizations use things like Jira or SQL or whatever it is,
Yep.
but you might go to an organization that doesn't use those tools.
Correct.
So what you want to do is focus on those core foundational fundamentals
Hmm.
that are going to be applicable at any organization, regardless of the tools. And
Yep.
communication is one of those foundations, right?
Right.
We know that at any organization, they're always going to value a business analyst who's an effective communicator, right?
Hmm.
So I always say, when you're in the market, or just in general trying to improve
Hmm.
your career, focus on the fundamentals or the principles, and
Yeah.
you can get more explicit with the tools based on the organization's need once you're in there.
Hmm.
Because
Yeah.
once you know your organization is using these tools, then
Hmm.
you want to invest the time and the energy into becoming more proficient in those tools.
True.
Because otherwise, you don't want to waste your time for
Hmm.
something that you're never going to use, right?
Correct. That's a good point. That's a good point.
Yeah. So, Tom, can you share a story maybe from your own experience or maybe one
Sure.
of your clients' experiences where communication has really either helped or even rescued a project or some type
Mhm.
of initiative within an organization?
Yeah, yeah. I can think of a few, but I think the best one would be I was working with a team and just kind of coming in new and trying to understand what, where things were. And I think where communication really helped is we had kind of, to your point, kind of an explicit meeting where we called out some things and made sure people understood what people were talking about and the terminology and kind of come together because it was one of those classic scenarios, Michael, where people kind of talking past each other. We had some stakeholders that were, you would say, demanding, and
Mm.
once we had a explicit conversation about things, particularly about just calling out priorities, right? And I think that's an important thing as business analysts probably see this every day. But sometimes you might have a stakeholder or a business person that's sharing all these things and saying they're all priorities, and then you kind of have to have that level set conversation. It's like,
Yes.
okay, if we want, we need to identify one, two, three. We need you to rank these. And I think when you have that conversation with them, and I've been with people like this where you have that conversation. Sometimes it takes a while, but you can see the light go on, and they're like, oh, okay, I understand, why this is important. And then two, if they see that, and then you're able to execute on that, and then okay, then you can like start to make things happen where before it's like they're just like, where's this, where's this, where's this, where's this, it's like, we can't have 5 or 10 top priorities. It's just not going to work.
Right.
And
Right.
having that explicit communication, calling that out, and just seeing the lights go on is like, okay, they get it now.
Yes. They get it finally.
Yes,
Awesome.
yes.
Thank you for that.
Mhm.
So, Tom, before we move into our next set of questions, can you just share with our audience, some of the services that you provide or your offerings, and also how our audience can reach out to you?
Yeah, yeah. So, I do a lot of speaking and workshops with business analysts and other. I kind of focus on business analysts and some with project managers. I do a lot with them as well. I find that this kind of a space where people are important and impact the team. And I, like I said, so if they feel free to, the best way to reach me is on LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn a lot, as many of us are. And I think that's something, a good way to get in contact with me.
Awesome. And that's Tom Henricksen.
Hmm.
And I'll link that information below if anybody does want to reach out to Tom. And also, you have written some books.
Correct.
Can you
Correct.
talk a little bit about a couple of those?
Yeah, yeah. I've written a few books, as you mentioned, especially for business analysts. But the one that, like we're talking about today, building bridges for communication for business analysts, I think is just a really good reminder. It's something I guess I've learned. It's kind of funny. I always think as a developer coming up through the ranks and being a leader, but just kind of helping people understand the importance of communication. There's a lot of jokes about developers and their lack of communication. Even Saturday Night Live has kind of some poke fun at it as well. So but yeah,
Imagine
it's
that.
right. Art imitating life. So it's
Mm,
I think it's one of those things that we all have to be honest with our shortcomings, and but it's so important thing that we need to all think about.
awesome. Thanks for that. Okay. So, if you could give just one piece of advice to the community about,
Mhm.
or even a new business analyst regarding communication, what would it be?
I would think just, I talked a little bit about it before, but just the importance of clarity, kind of understanding
Yes.
what's being asked of you. So if you're a new business analyst, just asking questions with, your new leader and your teammates, making sure you understand, okay, what am I being asked to do? What is the outcomes? And two, just understanding that. I think along with that, that clarity we talked about before of priorities. Because if you have clarity on what you're doing and what your priorities are, then you should, be able to figure out, okay, what's the number one thing I need to work on today. And then if I complete that, I can move on to the next thing. As opposed to, you were talking earlier, Michael, about how we are all multitasking and we're doing this and we're doing that
Yes.
and we're doing that. And when we do, three things or five things, we just I've heard somebody say multitasking, a great way to do a lot of things bad. We don't do them
Yes.
very well. We kind of
Mhm.
do them halfway. They're not very good. And then we think,
Yeah.
oh, but I'm being productive. So yeah,
Yeah.
I think having that clarity, understanding, what's the outcome and then what's my priority.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you brought that up because I'm not a great multitasker, and I actually hate multitasking because I know that
Yeah.
your brain literally can't multitask. It's
Hmm.
really just task switching, right? Going back and
Correct.
forth.
Correct. Yeah.
And it slows down productivity because you're really resetting, right?
Hmm.
But I've even seen some job descriptions that says, "Oh, we want a multitasker," and I'm just like, "No,
Yeah.
you don't want that. What you really want is somebody that can focus and get the job done."
Right. Right.
So yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing that's out there. Like, I don't even know how multitasking became this glorified uh,
Yeah.
trait, right?
Yeah.
But what I will say in regards to your comment about clarity, another thing I think is really important for us as business analysts is to way early in the project,
Hmm.
even if we're doing like a team charter or something like
Oh
that,
yeah.
or during the
Hmm.
forming stage of a project, you want to
Hmm.
get clarity in your role as a business analyst. Because I
Right.
found one, well, there's two levels to this. One, you want to get clarity in your role as a business analyst when you enter a new company or organization,
Hmm.
because many organizations has their own perception of what a business analyst is and how they need to use them. So
Right.
you want to get clarity from your leadership and the project team. What is the expectation of a business analyst at this particular organization?
Hmm.
And I would also say you want to go broader, which is why we do business analysis training, because you want to have that benchmark of the global or the foundational role of a business analyst. You can see, does what this organization say a business analyst role is align with the global expectation,
Hmm.
the global benchmark, right? Because some
Right.
organizations use a business analyst in a more technical way, some use
Hmm.
it in a more business oriented way, right? So you really want to
Yeah.
have that understanding.
Hmm.
And then we want to get clarification about our role depending on the team composition, right? Because
Yep.
every team composition is a little bit different. So, you might be on a team with other business analysts, or you might be on a team where there's a data analyst
Hmm.
or a business architect to where they can do some of those more systematic things that
Hmm.
we would have to do if they weren't on the team, right? So we want to know when we don't want to step on other people's toes, or if there's a project to where we would be doing these types of things, right?
Yeah.
And be comfortable with that, right?
Hmm.
So getting clarity in your role is so important, not only from organization to organization, but
Yep.
also from project to project as well.
Correct. Correct. Yeah, there's lots of changes. Like you said, it's interesting as you look at like the business analyst role. And if you did, like you mentioned, different companies will call them slightly different things. They'll
Yeah.
have a little bit of different, it might be a technical business analyst or
Yes.
a systems business analyst, or,
Yes.
the terminology changes, like you said. And that's good just to kind of be clear from the organization. And then too, within the team, you might be in the same organization, you might switch teams and they might have you do slightly different things too. So you need to be
Yeah.
very flexible.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I love to do whenever I do get into a new organization is I like to just sit with the teams. Like,
Hmm.
I like to sit with developers, I like to sit with
Hmm.
the QA team, I like to
Yeah.
sit with architects, project managers, to see really what their day-to-day is and what's important to them. And
Hmm.
that lets me know how I can serve those roles with my role, right?
Hmm.
Because the business analyst is we're such like a nucleus to where we're just interconnected with all of these other
Correct.
roles, and providing them with information that
Yeah.
is like an input for them to do their jobs, or
Hmm.
things like that. So it's really important to have an understanding of how they're using their tools, what information they're
Hmm.
using, because I have been in environments where, I have been producing documents that the development team totally was not using,
Yeah.
or they were translating somehow. And I'm like, well,
Hmm.
if that's what you need, let me know that. I am more
Right.
than willing to
Hmm.
create this documentation or to create this artifact if that's
Yeah.
what you need. I'm
Hmm.
flexible, right?
Yep.
So, understanding not only how they're going to use what you provide them, but also
Hmm.
like their day to day and what's important to them. I think that
Correct.
could be really helpful in our role because this is like I don't want to say that servant leader role, but it's really a role that's
Hmm.
here to not only bridge those gaps
Right.
in communication, but we serve a lot of other project roles. So
Correct.
understanding their day to day is really
Hmm.
important for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I kind of think of the business analysts. I know I said a utility player earlier, but I think if you've read the book Linchpin, Seth
Mhm.
Godin, he talks about being
Yes.
and being able to, like you said, be flexible, get people the right information, and then to adjust on the fly. Like you said, maybe they need to modify the way they're doing something to get people so they can be more productive, whatever it takes.
Yeah, that's it. I've always been kind of a team player, but I'm that type of person, whatever it takes to get the job done. If we
Hmm.
don't have a QA person, I'll do QA testing,
Yeah.
things like that, right?
Yep.
And some business analysts might not be willing
Hmm.
to go outside of their scope of work. So,
Correct.
when we just talked about understanding the benchmark, but sometimes you need to go outside of that benchmark to get the job
Right.
done. And,
Hmm.
especially in terms of, career progression,
Hmm.
organizations value that somebody
Yeah.
who is going to fill in the gap, right? And
Correct.
help the team move forward versus, oh, I don't do that or I can't do that. But it's like,
Hmm.
what can
Yeah.
I do to help us
Right.
get to our goal? Yeah.
Yep. You got it, Michael. You
So
got it.
that shift that needs to happen if you're serious about
Correct.
moving up in the world.
Correct.
Awesome. And finally, Tom, what resources you kind of talked about a couple? You talked about Linchpin, but
Hmm.
what other books or practices or even daily habits would you recommend a business analyst who's looking to sharpen up on their communication skills?
Yeah. I think we talked a little bit about, but like Toastmasters, I think is a great thing. Anything with communication, getting you in there, learning how, because kind of like you brought up earlier, Michael, sometimes people are afraid to speak up in a meeting. And I think just the act of going to like a Toastmasters and learning how to speak extemporaneously and being able to, speak off the cuff about things can be really helpful. It kind of gives you that confidence. And I think that's one of the
Yeah.
things, we all need that confidence to be able to say, okay, I can talk, I don't need to be overly prepared. You want to be prepared, right? But sometimes even the best preparation, things are going to go haywire, and you're going to be thrown into a situation where you didn't know,
Yeah.
something just comes up, and you got to be able to talk about it. So I think that's one of the things with like Toastmasters is important. And then two, just like you mentioned, kind of reading a wide array of things that I think is helpful for me, and just keep you well versed on the business end of what's going on.
Yeah, when you mentioned Toastmasters, it reminded me of when I was in grad school. I took a communications class,
Hmm.
and I remember my professor, she was in Toastmasters, so she would take a lot of the concepts
Hmm.
from Toastmasters and kind of teach it to us and things like that. And one of the things that we had to do in the course is we would have to get up in front of the class and
Yeah.
she would just say a topic and we would just have to do the improv
Go.
just right there and go. I thought that was such a useful skill,
Mm,
to just be able to, well, not skill, but a useful exercise to
yeah.
just give someone a topic and see how well they can just riff off of that, and
Hmm.
just think of things to talk about.
Right.
And we were assessed on not only what we talked about, but also what we were doing with our body language, where we work in the
Hmm.
room or work in the floor,
Right.
and things like that, what gestures we were using during that time. So I thought that was such a useful exercise
Hmm.
that I believe she got that from Toastmasters. So can you
Hmm.
just talk a little bit about Toastmasters in general?
Hmm. Yeah, Toastmasters is worldwide. So anybody wherever you're hearing this, if you're in Australia, they have chapters there as well. It's all over the world. But they have weekly meetings. You go, just real simply is the first thing you do is you start. You get I believe they still do the same curriculum, but 10 books or 10. Excuse me. You get a book and you have 10 to go through the book. You have 10 speeches you give. the first speech that usually people do with Toastmasters, you do a speech about yourself, right? We should all know our topic of ourselves. So you start out
Yeah.
just kind of a speech about yourself. But I think it's a great thing. It's a great environment, like you said, to be in, and kind of like your class. It sounds like your professor was doing a similar thing of getting people talking and just being used to it and getting feedback about it. One of the big things I remember is as you go into a Toastmasters meeting, they have an up counter and out counter, and
Oh
it's
my
a
goodness.
new speaker. That's you get the crutch words, and we all have
Yes.
them, right? But it's just something, if you once you're cognizant of it, you can kind of correct. You're not going to be perfect. Nobody's perfect, but just kind of help you understand if you have certain things like that, or mannerisms. Some people, like, I probably
Yes.
use you can see me using my hands. Some people are like, it's too expressive. You'll say, Tom, tone
Yeah.
down the hand usage,
Yeah.
or whatever. Everybody has a different, but it's a good environment just to get some feedback, help you kind of learn and.
Yes, and I love the concept of getting that feedback because one, you're right. I remember that was one of the things that we talked about is those filler words,
Mhm.
using those. And when I started doing YouTube and editing my own videos, I was so not aware of how often I use the word,
Mhm.
and I'm just like, okay, clip that
Yep.
out. And I'm just like, holy smokes, that's like
Yeah.
half of what I'm saying. Like, it's really eye-opening to
Mhm.
you either get feedback for someone else or to go over or review your own communication and give
Right.
your own self-assessment, right? But yeah,
Yep.
I think that that's really important if
Mhm.
communication is a big part of
Yeah.
your role, which it is for any business analyst,
Mhm.
because I feel like a lot of the students that I have lean towards a lot of them are analytical, and they
Mhm.
like the concept of being at a desk and quietly doing the
Mhm.
analytical work, but they
Yeah.
shudder at the thought of facilitating a meeting or
Correct.
you know doing a
Mhm.
workshop or something like that. I'm like, that's a major piece of
Right.
what we do as business analysts. So
Correct.
for those particular individuals that struggle with that, we definitely spend a lot of time on that. And a note that I would want to add is for people who do struggle with public communication or public speaking
Mhm.
is preparation.
Right.
Preparation can go such a long way.
Mhm.
Um, Preparing the questions you're going to ask, what you're going to say, when you're going to say it. And it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be too rehearsed, but just enough so that you can keep the things flowing, right?
Right.
And for me, I know the more prepared I am, the more confident I feel going in.
Mhm.
And the more confident you have, it can override that anxiety you have. But
Correct.
to Sherry, we talked about how most people tend to hold on to negative thoughts and negativity, and
Mhm.
they go in thinking, oh, I'm going to bomb or things like that. But we
Yeah.
have to really see ourselves doing well in public speaking and communicating and doing the little tasks that can help tip the scales in that direction of effective communication for sure.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah. All right. Well, Tom, I think that's all I have in terms of communication. I think this has been such a good conversation because, communication is such a big
Mhm.
part of what we do in business analysis. So we can never really talk about it enough in the BA
Correct.
space or in any space for that matter. So I really appreciate you taking the time to give our community some tips and
Mhm.
some tips and tactics about how to be more effective in communications in the business analysis space. So I'm hoping that the audience gets a lot of value out of this, and I'm hoping you'll come back and join us sometime.
Sure. It'd be great. It'd be great. I've enjoyed the talk with you, Michael. It's always good to chat with you.